Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unreal Fest. A special thanks to everyone here in the room. I know you had a party last night, so thank you for coming here early in the morning. We promise we're not going to make things too heavy for you this morning. We have a practical session about how you can power your games with our free backend services with a product called Epic Online Services.
All right.
Intro, Josh.
Yep. Sorry, my name's Josh Markwitz, lead engineer with Epic Online Services. I've been with Epic for about 15 years. I helped with dedicated servers for Gears of War, got a lot of the online infrastructure set up for Fortnite, and now we're trying to bring that out to all our external partners that want to use the SDK.
And my name is Rajan. I work as a technical account manager at Epic, so I help studios and publishers all over the world with integrating Epic Online Services into their games and bringing their games to the Epic Games Store. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to give you an overview of what Epic Online Services is and kind of what our current focus areas are, what our roadmap is. And then I'll jump into how you can actually get started using Epic Online Services with our developer portal. Then Josh is going to take over.
Yeah, I'll be working with the overview of the SDK. I'll talk about some of the fundamentals and basics that kind of founded the principles of why we wanted to do things the way we do. And then we'll get into a few examples, and then we'll talk about the online subsystem plugins in the engine.
Cool. So Epic Online Services is a set of backend services, like I mentioned. It's free for everyone to use. And we categorize these into two main areas. One is called game services, which are universal services that you can use anywhere. You can deploy it anywhere. You can use any of our supported identity providers. I'll show you a bunch of those in a little bit later. And they cover services in these areas, right? So multiplayer, progression, moderation, and operations. And then on the other hand, we have Epic Account Services, which uses our Epic Games account system to provide you functionality across social, and it has an in-game overlay for players to interact with those social features. Now here's a slide breaking down that a little bit more. Here's all the services that we offer. I'm not going to go into detail of each one of these, but know that any of these things are kind of a la carte, so you can pick whatever you need in your game for whatever platform you're deploying on. And you can only use those. You only have to use those services. They are pretty independent of one another. The other thing to remember here is that these are kind of distinct areas, right? So you don't need to use Epic Accounts or Epic Account Services to use any of those game services. You can use any other identity system, your own, Xbox Live, Steam, Facebook, whatever, to kind of get access to those for players. And then the last thing to remember is that there's also a third component kind of in here that the Epic Online Services SDK covers, which is APIs to interact with the Epic Games Store. We're not going to go into detail today, but if you're interested, we obviously have documentation on that as well. So the question we get a lot when we first start talking about Epic Online Services is, hey, why is Epic doing this and why for free, which is probably the more important question. And the answer is pretty straightforward, right? So we built these services kind of for Fortnite to begin kind of the online backend for Fortnite. And these services were kind of born from that. And now we're running those at scale. We're running them in our own games. We're running them for the Epic Games Store. And we figured we want to make these services available to kind of grow this notion of cross-play and cross-progression and online backends in the industry so it's accessible for everyone to use. This kind of enables players, obviously, to interact with their friends and to play online. Communities are growing, and in turn, the entire industry will kind of get uplifted by it if everyone kind of creates this inclusive game infrastructure, basically. But probably the most important piece is that we love seeing creative experiences from any game studios. So we want to help you to focus on making those unique experiences and not writing the backend code to kind of support those things. So I just mentioned a bunch of things in terms of cross-play and cross-progression. One important area that we see today is, players want to be able to play everywhere and how they want, where they want. So there's a lot of terms that come into play with that, cross-save, cross-platform. But it really boils down to players wanting to be able to pick up their game on any of their devices. They want to be able to access any of their progression across these devices and play with all of their friends. Which poses a real challenge for game developers in general, right? Because this is the landscape that we're dealing with today, which includes every platform having kind of their own social ecosystem in there. They have their own set of APIs. So for players, that means that they're siloed from their friends if they're not on the same platform. But then for a game, it means you have to build different versions, implementing different APIs for each one of these platforms. So taking the example of, Alice, she buys your game on Xbox, and she's excited about the game. She's friends with Bob, and she wants to play with him. But Bob has purchased a game on PlayStation, so there's no real interaction there by default. How do you solve that problem? It's not an easy problem to solve. So taking a look at that challenge, we can set out to achieve 4 goals in this space. One is to provide a centralized cross-store friends list. So Bob and Alice can find each other in a social overlay or of some sort, or a friends list in general. They can become friends, they can invite each other, et cetera, et cetera. Then the second point is, we don't want people to have like this upfront experience of like, oh, to do this, you will have to, fill out 14 different forms to create an account and like all these things that, we all enjoy very much in life. So Alice and Bob need to be able to quickly establish that account connection and then go from there. So we have this notion called proxy accounts, and Josh is going to go into a little bit more detail about what that is. But that basically just eases the entry point for Bob and Alice to create accounts. And then once they are in that social experience, we want to make sure that it's a secure one where no one can really interact with their experience in a malicious way. So we wanted to limit the ways that, for example, you can add and delete friends. Bob and Alice are always in control of that experience, right? So I can't just go in as a developer, maybe by accident, like deleting their entire friends list. That's always a thing that they're in control of. And then obviously the important piece for you all as well is that it is plug and play for you, because again, we don't want you to focus a lot on integrating these services and spend a lot of time there. We want to make sure that we provide that for you as the service, so you can focus on other things. Now here's a quick view of our current this is a snapshot, obviously, of our current roadmap. So you can see here the things that we have delivered in services already. It kind of maps to the slide earlier. There's a couple things that we are actively improving, like the social system, where we're obviously making things better there to make that even more seamless, integrating those things across different areas. And then we're also adding new features, obviously. So in the social ecosystem, parties and chat are one of the things that we're looking at offering. But if you take a look at one of the more recent kind of things that's growing in the industry is that every game has its own ecosystem of items and currency and all those things. And you want to be able to securely store that inventory for each player. So we have a secure inventory service in the works that allows you to kind of manage all that, so you don't have to create that own backend service yourself. There's a URL here and a QR code if you want to jump to our roadmap. That's always going to provide you with the latest information about what we have to offer and what we're working on next. All right, so getting started with Epic Online Services, you're going to need 3 things. One is an Epic Games account. Then you're going to have to do some configuration in the developer portal, and then you're going to need the Epic Online Services SDK, obviously, to integrate into your game. So what are Epic Games accounts? Hopefully everyone knows. Hopefully everyone has one. But if you don't, it is our single identity system that we use across all Epic Games products, right? So Epic Online Services uses it. The Epic Games Store uses it. Players actually use this to log into games, Fortnite, et cetera. Third-party games as well, if they use this system. And developers use it, obviously, to gain access to the developer portal. So it's pretty easy. You need the one account, and you can kind of go across all these different areas. We have over 500 million players today with this account system, so it's also a great opportunity if you want to create a social experience in your game, but you don't want to build up that whole social ecosystem from scratch, right? Like, you don't want to ask people to re-add all their friends in your ecosystem again if they've already done that in a different system. So you can leverage that in your game as well. Now, the developer portal, we're going to dive a little bit more into kind of the actual experience of the developer portal next, but I wanted to take you through kind of the hierarchy of this, because me working with a bunch of these game studios, this is a question that we get often, is like, hey, how does this all kind of relate to each other? So it all starts out with an organization, which kind of represents the studio or the publisher inside of Dev Portal. So you create an organization, and then within an organization, you can create one or more products. And the product are basically, it's a representation of your game or your games in there. Each product has access to one or more sandboxes, and these are kind of scoped environments for you to make configuration, right? So you can separate out your dev and your stage and your live environments. And then each one of these sandboxes, you can configure one or more deployments. And a deployment is really a way for you to kind of isolate player data. So if you want to have in your test environment, you're unlocking achievements and you're doing a bunch of things, you don't want that to carry over to your live game. You would use a different deployment. And all of the data that is stored as part of the game services that we offer is kind of scoped to that specific deployment. Then we have clients. So clients are basically where you define, like, hey, this is the thing I'm going to connect from the SDK or from my backend to Epic Online Services. And with clients come client policies. And within these client policies, you define the capabilities of that client. So you can determine if I can create a lobby or I can unlock an achievement, all these things. So typically, we see that there's separate clients for the game itself and for the server, because obviously the game, you should inherently just assume that it's not trusted and not a trusted environment. And maybe you don't want players to unlock achievements maliciously by kind of spoofing the calls, et cetera. So there's a separation there that you can do. And then lastly, we have the Epic Account Services side, where you have an application, which it's called, and then that kind of controls the access that you request from players. So if I want access to their friends list, if I want access to their country information, those are things that you can specify. And then the brand settings is basically how that presents itself to the user. So with your icon, your website, and those types of things. So that's a whole lot of terminology, and I don't expect you to remember all of this at once. So let's take a look at that kind of in context with the developer portal to see what that experience looks like. So this is the organization creation screen, right? So once you first go into Dev Portal or you create a new organization, this is a choice that you have to make. The main thing you have to remember between these choices is that if you pick the top choice, you will have everyone who is a member of that organization, so every user that you add to that organization, they will be responsible for signing the EULAs and the developer agreements as they access different functionality in the portal. The bottom one, you'd kind of delegate that functionality to a single person, so your legal representative or some owner within that organization. Otherwise, it's pretty similar. You can always upgrade from the top one to the bottom one later if that's something that you require. So once you sign in to your organization, this is the developer portal you're presented with. On the left side, you get some options to manage your organization. You can view some of the accounts for the players of your game and kind of do maintenance on there and manage that. You can download the SDK, obviously, and then you have your list of products. So you can create new products, or you have a list on the right side of the different products that you've created. If you create a product, it's very straightforward. You provide a name. You provide that background image as optional thing. That's just for the developer portal, by the way, so you don't see that anywhere represented outside of the developer portal, but it's an easy way for you to recognize, if you have a list of 15 games, maybe, it's easier to click into the one you're looking for. So once you click into that product, the left menu changes to all the different sections that you can use to configure all the different areas, right? So for the Epic Game Store, but obviously for game services and Epic Account Services as well, there's some analytics there that we provide, so you can dig into those as well. And then there's a product settings option at the bottom. If you click into the product settings option, the first thing you'll see is kind of the credentials that you'll be using for the SDK. So these are the IDs that you would pass within your SDK if you connect to the Epic Online Services backend. You see that some of the stuff here is populated, some of it isn't, so we'll walk through kind of that experience as well. The second tab that you'll see is the sandboxes that I just mentioned, right? So here you can kind of manage those sandboxes and deployments. By default, you will have access to the live sandbox, which is the main thing that's kind of live, obviously. The dev and the stage sandboxes will be disabled until you access functionality within Developer Portal that requires that. So if you publish to the Epic Game Store, for example, those will come available for you. But you can always click on deployments and then manage your deployments within a specific sandbox to create multiple environments. You can create these things as public or as private. Kind of depends on what you need and how you want people to access this deployment and the data that's contained within. So moving on to the next tab, identity providers. This is where you set up the, surprise, surprise, identity providers to connect to these different sandboxes. So let's say you want someone on Xbox to be able to use their Xbox Live ID to connect to these game services. This is where you could configure that. So if you click on the Add Identity Provider, you see a list of all the identity providers we support today. There's also OpenID at the bottom, so if you have your own identity provider, you can definitely bring that in here as well. But so you can configure all of these, and once you do, you can associate that with a sandbox, and then from then on, someone can connect directly using their Xbox Live ID, for example. In the Clients tab, you'll see this screen sometimes. I just mentioned there's EULAs that you need to sign, obviously, like any service. This is what you'll see when one of those things is required to be signed. In this case, if I sign it, you will see a notice up top, like, hey, if you want to also access the anti-cheat functionality, there's a separate EULA for that, right? Because it has its own user agreement. But once you've signed all those things, you can add clients in here. So you can, when you add a client, the first thing you'll do is obviously give it a name, and then you can assign a client policy to this. And so the client policy is really where you define, hey, these are the features and the actions within those features that this client has access to. So again, my earlier example, if I want my game client to be able to retrieve my achievement definitions to display them in the game, but I don't want them to unlock the achievements in the game, this is what you'll configure, and then if an unlock call is made or spoofed, you will actually get an error back from the SDK saying, hey, you're not permitted to do that. You need to change your client permissions in here. And you can change these on the fly, obviously, depending on what you need. So once you do that, you'll get an overview here. You can even limit by IP address who has access to, who can connect to this client, et cetera. And then that client will populate in here in the overview. You can edit this at any time, like I said. The last tab that you'll see here is called Player Groups. Player Groups is a feature where you can provide access to an extended group of people to private deployments and private sandboxes that you may not want to add into the developer portal. So by default, only members of the developer portal can access private sandboxes and private deployments. With Player Groups, let's say you have a QA department that is maybe a vendor that you hire for QA specifically, you can give them access to your game to log in and test the game without giving them access to the dev portal where they could potentially make configuration changes and those things as well. So that's what you use Player Groups for. Now you have Epic account services. Moving on to that, in here you will see the application. By default, there's an application created for you. You will see the brand settings and the permissions and the linked clients that I talked about. The brand settings, you can configure, obviously, the name, an icon, a website, a privacy policy URL. Then you submit that to us, and we'll review that everything is OK, and we'll approve it. And from that moment on, people can actually authenticate with your game without being members of the developer portal again. So you'll see that notice up top until you kind of verify your brand settings with us. And then on the permissions tab, like I said, there's different scopes that you can request from users. So by default, you get access to their basic profile. But if you want access to their friends list, this is something that you can enable. And then on the left side is the representation that users get when you do this consent request. So they can see, like, hey, this game will access my friends list, or it will access my online presence, et cetera. And then the last tab, pretty straightforward. You link the client that we just created to this application. So when I connect with this client, it knows that this actual consent is applicable and that needs to be shown to the user to provide consent. So once we've done all that, going back to the product settings, this is all now populated. So you have a client ID, a client secret, which you'll use in the SDK to connect to these services. And then the last tab, obviously, is downloading the SDK itself. So there's different options for the SDK. There are different types that we offer. By default, you will have access to the C, the C#, the iOS, and the Android SDK. If you have access to console platform SDKs from Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, there's a process for you to let us know, and then you will get access to our equivalent SDKs as well. So that'll pop up in this type dropdown. And then you'll select a version. We offer the latest 3 versions, the releases that we have, including the patch releases for each one of those. So once you've got that all set up, you're all configured in the dev portal, you can actually start using the SDK. So Josh is going to take you through that experience.
Okay. All right, well, thanks, Rajan. Yeah, let's start talking about some of the goals of the SDK, the fundamentals that we've kind of established for you, and the kind of the means that we had for accomplishing them. So the primary goal of the SDK is, as Rajan mentioned, is to let you focus on the game. We want to focus on common workflows that make your jobs easier, like authentication and account creation. We'll handle that. We want to provide support for social features via the common overlay and its interfaces. For games that are on the store, we offer a purchasing overlay so that you can handle in-game transactions. Again, we'll deal with the credit cards. We'll handle that stuff, and you don't have to bother you with that. We also want to address trust and safety issues that make sense for us to do so. We, on native platforms, we will look at the block list, we'll look at the user permissions, and where it's appropriate, we'll handle those things to the best of our ability, as well as text sanitization, for example. We also want to handle common patterns for errors and resiliency. So for example, we'll deal with the auth tokens. As they go to expire, we'll try to recover from that. So things you just don't have to worry about. Notifications from the backend services will route to you as appropriate. And we'll deal with network retries and things like that when there's issues with the connectivity. We also want to deal with integration with first parties like Xbox or Steam, just to reduce your coding effort. And that's kind of in its infancy. We're working on doing more and more, but we also want to be aware that there are more advanced options and you may want to take control of some of those things. But we also want to, of course, make it easy to fit into your tool chain. So we've worked on making it plugin friendly. We're going to talk about the Unreal Engine's online subsystem in a little bit. But as well, we've already noticed there's a lot of marketplace plugins that seem to exist. So we want to make sure that you guys can take advantage of them as well. So the SDK was initially developed using Unreal Engine 4. We wanted to get up and running really quickly, but we also wanted to take advantage of the man years of time that we've spent, on our core libraries, our containers, the memory allocators, things like that. It allows us to share our platform updates and engine fixes with the rest of the company. We benefit from them. They benefit from us as well. And so the C interface, we were, in the early days of the store, we had a lot of partners that just weren't using Unreal Engine. So we wanted to make a choice early that would give folks the opportunity to use this SDK without worrying about Unreal Engine integration. Of course, this is Unreal Fest, so hopefully you guys are all on Unreal Engine, but it works there too. And of course, a part of our C choice gave us a stable application binary interface. At least with my experience, I know having to make requests of developers, can you recompile this way? Can you recompile it in Visual Studio 2017, 2018, or 2022 now? So working with C made this a lot more stable for us. So hopefully there's a lot less back and forth with you guys as we develop new iterations of the SDK. So let's talk about some of the patterns that you'll see. We have this in the documentation. We want to kind of make it easy, you guys, for understand why we do what we do. So if you look at the headers, we created a consistent naming convention that segments APIs into namespaces and should make it pretty clear where you're working and why. We find a lot of common naming patterns, such as create and copy. Should be clear that we're doing something with memory there. Comes with a subsequent release function with the expectation that you need to free that memory when you're done with it. We also have, we try to differentiate between queries and gets. Queries are asynchronous calls that will go out to the back end. They always have a callback when they're done. They have error codes about what happened. And we also allow you to provide a context pointer such that when the callback does come back, whatever context you were working in, you can retrieve that easily. On the other hand, we have get. Get is more like a cache thing. You won't be going out to the back end. We obviously want people to use the cache data more than calling query, but just make sure it's kind of clear what the differences are. Everything works with opaque handles where appropriate. So typically each interface has an opaque handle. There are some major objects that, again, rather than having you get individual pieces of something, we give you a whole handle and then you can hold on to that for as long as you want to access the individual pieces as necessary. So more fundamentals here, data marshaling. Obviously C is not C++, so we tried to simplify or at least minimize the kind of work we do with marshaling data back and forth with the SDK. So first off, we want to copy all the input that we ever get from you, so there's no confusion about the lifetime of data that you're sending to us. Subsequently, when we give data back to you, we kind of expect you to copy it in most cases, if not all cases, just to kind of be clear that who owns the memory and trying to get you back into your own safety net of memory management as you go. All strings we treat as UTF-8. So again, just so there's no confusion, we expect things in and we pass things out as UTF-8. To help with some of the more complex containers, we try to provide helpful functions like get counts that'll tell you how big an array is, get by key name for like maps and things of that nature, as well as get by index functions so that you can iterate on the containers. We don't typically pass back. We're not trying to pass back tmap or tarray or really large complex containers in that way. At the same time, we tried to put a lot of effort into batching. I know from my experience working with other SDKs, it was always unclear, like whether you had to manage it yourself or whether if you were in a for loop, whether I was exceeding the limits of the SDK. So with batching, we try to make it so that you don't have to care about that. Like if we have limits on the back end, we'll subdivide your data and call the code independently so that works appropriately. We also want to make sure, like, we'll do some things temporarily such that you could call something a lot in a for loop, and we won't trigger off like 20 different calls to the back end. We'll try to batch that up ourselves, send that back to you at the appropriate time. Onto error handling. So we expose our logging via registered callback. You're free to do with that what we want. We don't try to like be invasive. We don't log to disk. We don't take up memory with things like this. We just pass the stuff back to you, so you're free to do things as you want. Also, we have log verbosity similar to UE4 and UE5. You can set and change that verbosity as you need when you're debugging things or when you ship. We also try to do a really good job with input validation. We have tons of unit tests to make sure, like, all the crazy ways you guys might accidentally call a function, we don't crash, or we at least try to provide helpful information to you about how this might work. And then, of course, we have quite an exhaustive list of error codes to try to make it very clear what's going on so that they don't all map to, invalid call or something that's just not helpful to anyone. Finally, something I added, I hope that it gets some value. It's kind of debatable at the moment, but we kind of call back our async calls. Like when we're retrying or when we're working through throttling issues or back-end connectivity issues, we do let you know so that ideally you can provide a UX experience to the player that we're having trouble connecting to a service or it's going to be a little bit longer. So I hope people can make use of that feature as well. So now that we've kind of covered the basics here, I just wanted to talk about one of these biggest source of things is like the key ring here, is that we have two services, as Rajan mentioned. We have the game services and we have account services. But one of the biggest mandates we had was to break them up and to make it so that you just don't have to use Epic accounts if you don't want to. You're free to use any of the services we have and just take the pieces that you want and connect them right up to an auth provider that maybe you're more comfortable with or you already have integrated with your game. So we abstracted away these things. We created something called the product user ID, which is, it's not an identifier, other than an identifier, it's nothing else. It doesn't hold a user's display name. It doesn't deal with email addresses and passwords and stuff like that. It's just simply something that the user is associated with. So we wanted to make sure that you could take, Steam, Xbox, PlayStation, or any other kind of provider there, set up a product user ID and get right into lobbies, voice, achievements, et cetera, without having to worry about how our stuff works or using your Fortnite account, if so choose. So the keyring, works like this, and it's just a level of indirection. You can swap these out, and then it won't really affect the user as long as there's one key on the keyring at any time. So let's see here. So let's talk about logging in. So this is a slightly modified version of what we have in our documentation online, but I just wanted to kind of show it here. You start with a login function, you take an external auth token, and you pass it into our functions. If it's successful, it means maybe the player's played before, okay, good, you're done. But what really I think people need to pay attention to in the early days is that initial experience. If they don't log in successfully, well, the question you have to ask yourself is, and get the user to understand is, have they played this game on another platform? One of the biggest issues we have is account merging. Folks making an account or not even realizing they have an account on Xbox, they go to play on Steam or PlayStation, they accidentally make a new account and they wonder where their progress is. So this kind of step is super important. If they haven't played on this platform before, we want to make it very clear to them, do you have another account? And of course, if they do, if you're not using Epic Account Services, there's slightly a little bit of complexity here working with, getting how do you log into a secondary auth provider such that you can then take the secondary auth that you've logged in with, take this new auth token that you had from before, combine them through link account, and then complete this step. So link account is the same as adding a key to the keyring, but in this case, if you don't use Epic Account Services, we have the functions, but the work is kind of on you to log in with these other things to get these credentials. If they don't have an account, if it's a first-time user new to your game completely, it's a little bit easier. You just call our create user function, it creates the platform user ID, and you're done. So that's kind of the Epic Account Services side of things. The other side is the Epic Online Service side of things. This is the Epic Account Service side of things. We want people to be able to access our user identity, as Rajan mentioned before. It gets you access to the social graph. It gets you access to their user presence. And you're going to have to implement this side if you want to be able to access that. The keyring's similar. Again, we expose Steam, Xbox, PlayStation. Typically, users have been pretty well set up in our, the 500 billion users that we have. But the good news here is that you can leverage the account portal to get the users logged in from this side. If you choose to go this route, you'd want to take this token and pass it back in the login code we just saw previously. The idea being that you have one key on that keyring and many keys on this keyring. We try not to mix the two because it's really it can cause accounts to kind of get orphaned and things like that. So you really want to kind of either choose this or choose that. But they do work together, as I was trying to say. So let's see here. We're going to talk about the login flow here is almost exactly the same. Sorry, I guess I got ahead of myself. We take the external auth token, we pass it in. We work through the account portal flows. This is an example of one of the intro screens. It just kind of lets the user know what external account they're going to be logging in with, what the Epic account is going to be. They have an option to sign in and go through that flow, or they can create an account. Now, creating an account here, in this case, is creating a proxy account. The idea is that it's a way for the user to skip account creation, but we still keep track of the users themselves, so that like if they're skeptical or they're not sure, they can still earn progress, and we can still have a place to attach their friendships that they're growing from a recent players list maybe. And when they see the value of the account, they can say, oh, I'd like to promote this to a full account. They go to epicgames.com, they give an email address and password, and they go. Otherwise, you do the sign-in flow, they log in with their Xbox account or their PlayStation account via the web, and they can log in right there. So I guess I kind of talked about proxy accounts there. The account portal flows. There's the DevAuth tool. DevAuth tool is, it basically emulates some of these flows for developers. You can sign in via a web page on your PC. Once you've done that, it keeps track of things, and the SDK will talk to that to give it auth tokens and sign in as if you were launching from the launcher, so you don't have to have the launcher running while you're developing. Okay. Let's see here. So let's talk about some scenarios with multiplayer and social interaction and voice chat. Going back to Bob and Alice, they are on two different ecosystems. How do we get them playing together? What does it really mean to be cross-play, cross-progressions, cross-social? So we'll start off with multiplayer. We do have two APIs in the SDK. One's called sessions, the other's called lobbies. What's the difference? Ultimately, they're not that different. They have different reasons for existing. Let's talk about some of the things in the middle that make them in common. Well, they have find and search capabilities. You can obviously look for if pistol's only true or time of day equals night. You can find either a session or a lobby that has those attributes that you're looking for. Random players are joining. I kind of put that there just to separate from the idea of parties, which is a different thing. These are the fundamental things that games would use, and you have a 10-player game, random players, maybe they'll become your friends someday. The associated data between them, we mentioned the key value pairs for finding and searching. You're free to set whatever you want. And then your traditional stuff like game invites. You can either programmatically send invites or use the overlay. Join via presence, the idea that you can click on a friend, see that they're online, they're actively inviting you or passively inviting you to play a game. You can join them without their explicit permission and just show up. Some of the differences for lobbies, it's clients only. This was a way to kind of get around, or one of the side benefits is you can get around NATs, strong NATs and strict firewalls and things like that. We host the lobby, so players can join there, and it doesn't matter you don't have to worry about the NAT when it comes time to join a thing. It provides a persistent connection, which gives you benefits of data updates. So anytime I change the data, everyone in the lobby will know that the data has changed. It also has a way for you to hook data per member. So in addition to saying pistol's only true, you could say that Josh is a level 6 knight or something like that, and it's just extra ways to kind of store the data and manage the data. And then it has voice chat, which we're going to get to in a little bit. You can optionally turn that on. Sessions is more traditional, like master server, register yourself with something, get a list of search results, and join. So that's typically in the dedicated server space. Dedicated servers don't have a persistent connection, so they kind of just make calls to the back end and let them know as things change when people use that for search results and to join. Wanted to mention, once mentioned peer-to-peer. So once a user finds a game, they need to be able to join it, of course, right? You're free to use your own network connection code. Obviously, Unreal Engine has a pretty powerful set with the NetDriver and the UNet connection. But one big thing it doesn't have is a way to kind of do the signaling between players in a peer-to-peer game. So we have the peer-to-peer API. It's basically a handle connection negotiation. It can hide IP addresses from the players, and if necessary, it can use a relay service to kind of get past those tricky firewalls so that players can still play with each other regardless of their configuration. Of course, as mentioned in a talk yesterday, it does have some latency associated with it. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle of a game session. This kind of maps, I tried to map this a lot to the way Unreal Engine does its thing. So you start by creating a modification handle. This is where you can pass all your initial data, key value pairs of how the session, the playlist, et cetera, is going to go. You call update session, and now the host is sitting idle. Players find that session, which we'll get to in the next set of slides, and they start to log in. You register the players with the session. After a certain number of time, the appropriate number of players are there. The gameplay starts. You call start session. That's important because if you don't support join in progress, you want to allow the back end an understanding that this search result should be thrown away and no longer given to players while the game is in session. So as the game plays, game state changes. You're free to update the data as you will. In a join in progress, maybe you're adding and removing the number of players, or map cycling changes the map name, things like that. You keep this up to date, and things happen. Eventually, if it's join in progress, players are logging out all the time, coming and going. Maybe the match ends, people log out, so you unregister the player. And finally, gameplay ends. You call end session. End session does not mean destroy session. It just basically puts it back into an idle state such that if people are searching, they can find the search result again. And if you say map cycle or you have other rounds to play, you can go back to the top and start again. Otherwise, you call destroy session and kind of return to the main menu or kick the players out and start all over again. So that kind of talks about how a game session works, and you're really just pairing the data that you have in Unreal with the bookkeeping that you need in the lobby or the session data there. So moving on to session search, this thing's going on. How do people join it? Well, they create search handle. It gives you access to, again, a set of key value pairs that you can set. You can do one of 3 search methods. You can kind of set the parameters, like I'm looking for a pistols only equals true game, or playlist ID equals 7 game. You're also free to set player ID if I'm looking for a specific person. Now, this won't let you find just anybody. We don't want to use that as a kind of a negative, toxic way to find and disrupt people's games. But there are use cases. It's documented how this works and what scenarios you can do. You can also search for session IDs specifically. Like if you say your game crashed and you launched again, you want to be able to find the session you were just previously playing in. You can do that too. So you call find sessions and you get a set of search results. Once you have your search results, you're kind of free to iterate through them. You can see how many you have. You can look at the data. Maybe you want to do some client-side sorting, right? You get 20 search results. Which are the best ones for you? Maybe you can do search criteria like nearest. So find me a game where the account level is nearest 20. So that's like the absolute value, like 19 and 21. Maybe there's an 18, but you're free to kind of search the results and figure it out yourself. Once you found one that you think is okay to join, you ask the back end. And if it's not already full, or if it's still alive, you'll get a success message. You take the search details from that, and you can use either an IP address to join the dedicated server, say, or a socket handle, which is in the peer-to-peer interface, and just make a request to join Josh, right? And it'll connect and do the work there. So we had Bob and Alice. They were friends in real life. And now we have a common matchmaking pool. In theory, they were able to find each other and play a game together, but they're still not, doing much as friends. So how do they leverage that friendship, right? Well, that's through the social overlay. As we mentioned before, this does require making use of Epic Account Services. But if you do, you get this overlay for free. Just to be clear, if you don't want to use the overlay, most, if not all, the functionality does exist in the APIs for you to run and create your own UX. Some things like friend management, we do want to control more critically, just because, again, we don't want people accidentally deleting friends lists. So you can work with the overlay. You have a list of your friends, people who are online, offline. You can hit invite and send them invites. You can search for friends. The little the badge up there at the top is like you can look at achievements and see what you've unlocked. There's a settings screen, so on and so forth. So you kind of have a wealth of information, the user presence, what game are they playing. You can send them invites, as I mentioned. We handle all the trust and safety, so we respect block lists, as I said. People that maybe are on your Xbox block list won't show up in this list. People that maybe if you try to send invites, but your parents have set user permissions to you can't play multiplayer games, these buttons won't work, or they'll tell you that, go get permission to get those things done. So as it makes sense, we try to handle trust and safety. Well, like I said, we also run text sanitization through any user-generated content that you can see on the screen, so that we can make sure that cross-play gamer tags are appropriate for the platform that you're on. Okay, so now Bob and Alice are in a game playing together. They have a friendship that they can leverage through the social overlay. Well, how can they communicate with each other while they're playing? So we offer voice chat in two forms. It's the same thing, it's just whether or not you want to bring your own set of trusted servers to the situation and you kind of want to go off on your own. It's a more advanced method. You can use our web APIs, or maybe you're running a dedicated server and you want to control rooms for teams or something like that. Or you can take use of a much simpler path and integrate with lobbies. Simply by setting a value, you can say, we'd like to have voice chat with the lobbies. But regardless of the method, the voice APIs are actually pretty robust. You can do things like setting your input, output. You can get access to the raw data streams if you want to do post-processing. Maybe you want to try to convert it to positional audio, things like that. So there's a lot of callbacks and things you can do with the voice code once you're connected. So let's talk a little bit about these two flows. In the case of lobbies, I said we host the trust. So basically the big thing on the right there, the lobbies understand player management. It knows the number of lobby members that are allowed. It knows when you're full or not full. So ultimately when you join the lobby successfully, the lobby code on the back end will talk to the voice service. It'll get you an auth token to communicate with the media service. And then once you've successfully joined the lobby, you join the media service, and then the SDK handles all the work of trying to keep the connection and keep you both in the lobby and in the voice chat at the same time. As we mentioned, or as Rajan mentioned briefly, the client policies, like you do have to kind of set this up so that you can tell us that you do want this feature to work that way. With Bring Your Own, the box kind of changes and it becomes your responsibility, if you're using a dedicated server or a game server of some kind or some other trusted source. The lobby membership or the player membership is your responsibility. And at the end of the day, when the game client talks to the service, your service, you would be responsible for knowing whether it's okay to kind of talk to the voice service. We have our APIs. You would get the auth token yourself, pass it back to the client. Then, of course, the client would connect as usual on your terms, not as part of lobby join. And again, there's a client policy that needs to be set for that. So now that we've kind of explored the basic capabilities of the SDK, Bob and Alice, they're voice chatting, they're matchmaking, they're sending invites to each other. Hopefully they're happy. How does this kind of fit into the Unreal Engine? Okay, so we have a plugin that we created at Epic. We use it for our own games. We've had, as I mentioned before, we've seen quite a few good third-party options. I haven't really looked into them too deeply, but when I went to their web pages, they seem to have good documentation and something we don't have, which is really good blueprint support. We are going to work on that. I'll talk about that in a minute. Our OSS plugins kind of come in two pieces. One we call OSS EOS, which is, as you'd expect, it is a wrapper around the SDK. It implements all the major features that we've just been discussing and more. And it also has one called EOS Plus. Now that one's, it's not really temporary, it's meant to be used, but the idea here is it wants to go beyond, it merges two OSSs together, the EOS one and then the native platform. So what you really want to do is it'll like get the Xbox token for you and log you into the game, and then things like it will keep an eye on sessions and lobbies and maybe do the native sessions and lobbies code so you can see things in presence on the Xbox dashboard. So we're going to try to take more responsibility of that and put it into the SDK, and we do have a flag that we're working on, managed by SDK versus managed by application. So we'll be look for that in the coming months as we create the SDK further and do more things. We also have a Lyra. Oh, hold on. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, next slide. Sorry. I was looking at the wrong slide. Apologies. Okay. So some things to keep in mind when working with the plugins. It does ship with the engine, but you're free to kind of look into GitHub and Perforce to kind of stay up to date with the changes we make. OSS typically doesn't have a lot of dependencies on the rest of the engine, so you can kind of get out of sync and not really impact yourself too much. Rajan showed you guys in the dev portal, you can bring your configuration values into the editor and save them there. It does bring you back to C++ from C, so that it's more convenient for most to work in C++. So I just mentioned the GitHub parts, and then we're just trying to do more of the heavy lifting. and make sure that you guys can focus on your game. It's demonstrated in Lyra. There is a web page and a QR code there on a whole tutorial on how we've integrated the SDK with Lyra. So I think that's a great jumping off point if you're interested in how the code works, get the code samples, and go from there. So this is a little bit just kind of the roadmap we have here of the future. With 5.0, we're introducing Online Subsystem version 2. So right now we're kind of working out what proof of concepts, prototyping it, see how it works, where it's going to go. UE 5.1, we implemented the OSV2 in the context of EOS. We added a null interface if you're familiar with OSS already, and an adapter that lets OSS v1 code work with OSS v2. So similarly, this online services plugin, which is the new name here, we will be implementing it in 2 flavors, one as a game services, and then extending it with EAS to add auth and friends. So again, if you don't want to use both, you don't have to. And of course, we're thinking about blueprints. We understand and we've heard loud and clear that it would be really nice to have better blueprint support. So we're working on should it be one-to-one with the rest of the SDK? Ideally, we'd like it to be like a matchmaking node that handles a lot of the code under the hood, tries to be friendly, and follows out the right callbacks as things progress through the platform. All right, so I think that's about it. I'm going to turn it back over to Rajan here.
Yeah, thanks. So just to wrap up here, to go over kind of what we covered, obviously Epic Online Services, free backend services that you can use to power any functionality in your game. You can use as much or as little of it as you want. You can deploy it on any platform, use any identity provider. We also showed you how to get started in the developer portal, getting the SDK itself, and then using the Unreal Engine OSS plugin. Everything that we talked about today, you can go to this URL, dev.epicgames.com/services. You'll find our documentation there. You'll find access to the SDK, the developer portal, and everything that we talked about. And with that, I want to thank you again for coming here this morning, everyone here and online. Thanks for coming to our talk.